The lifelong fracture between King Charles III and his father did not start in a palace drawing room. It began inside a wooden orange crate in 1922. In the chaotic aftermath of the Greco-Turkish War, an infant Prince Philip was smuggled aboard a British warship, his family stripped of their titles and banished into exile. Within years, his father had abandoned them for the gaming tables of Monte Carlo. His mother, Princess Alice, was institutionalized in a Swiss psychiatric clinic, and young Philip was left effectively orphaned, drifting between British relatives with little more than a suitcase. He found his salvation on the remote, storm-swept coast of Morayshire, Scotland, at Gordonston, a school created by the visionary German Jewish educator Kurt Hahn. Built on the Latin motto Plus est en vous, there is more in you, Gordonston demanded daily pre-dawn runs through freezing coastal rain, icy ocean baths, seamanship in treacherous waters, and manual labor. For Philip, this Spartan regime was not an ordeal. It was the steel armature that saved him from psychological ruin. Decades later, when the Duke of Edinburgh looked at his eldest son and heir, he saw a boy he could neither comprehend nor afford to indulge. Young Prince Charles was timid, artistic, and physically fragile, preferring a watercolor paintbrush, a cello bow, and solitary walks in the gardens to the rugged polo matches and naval drills his father lived by. To a decorated wartime naval officer who had survived trauma through sheer stoic detachment, Charles's sensitivity looked like an existential liability for a future monarch. Convinced that gentle handling would ruin the boy, Philip decided Charles had to endure the same freezing winds and uncompromising discipline that had forged his own survival. But the moment the order was given, a quiet war erupted inside Buckingham Palace. In May 1961, a private, urgent letter arrived on the desk of Queen Elizabeth II, threatening to upend Prince Philip's educational plans. Written by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the letter was an urgent plea to intervene, save the 13-year-old heir from Gordonston, and send him to Eton College. At Eton, located just across the Thames from Windsor Castle, Charles would be surrounded by the sons of the British establishment and close enough to visit his family every weekend for quiet tea, emotional reassurance, and steady pastoral care. Gordonston, by contrast, lay more than 500 miles north on the desolate Moray Firth. The Queen Mother warned that sending Charles so far north would isolate him completely, cautioning that the young prince might as well be at school at the end of the world. Senior courtiers and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan quietly backed the Queen Mother's stance, arguing that Eton was the natural, tested incubator for a British sovereign. Yet inside the palace walls, Philip's authority over the children's upbringing was absolute. Under an unwritten domestic arrangement struck early in the Queen's reign, Elizabeth commanded the affairs of state, but Philip ruled the household. The Duke dismissed Eton as a breeding ground for coddled aristocratic snobs, arguing that an elite Southern school would never forge the mental toughness required of a modern king. Overriding the Queen Mother's passionate objections, Philip held the line, and the Queen deferred to her husband's will. In May 1962, Philip personally piloted the aircraft that flew Charles north to RAF Lossiemouth, delivering his apprehensive son to the remote Scottish coast. The Queen Mother's warnings proved true the moment Charles arrived. At Windmill Lodge boarding house, the daily regime was engineered to strip away every shred of royal privilege. Every morning at 6:30, regardless of freezing temperatures or torrential rains, the boys were forced outside in thin cotton shirts and shorts for a cross-country run, followed immediately by mandatory freezing cold showers. The dormitory windows were kept propped open year-round, allowing biting winter snow to drift across the floorboards. Days were consumed by exhausting manual labor, from digging drainage trenches in the muddy soil to mandatory Coast Guard patrols along the stormy sea cliffs. But the physical exhaustion was the easiest part of the ordeal. Because of his royal status, Charles became an open target for vicious dormitory abuse. The school's egalitarian culture fostered an environment where being a prince carried a bullseye. Classmates who dared to show him basic kindness were immediately ostracized and accused of kissing up to royalty, leaving Charles in total social isolation without a single close friend. On the rugby pitch, boys on opposing teams and even his own teammates tackled Charles with unrestrained savagery, taking pride in driving the future king into the freezing mud while referees looked away. At night, older boys raided his bed, beating him in the dark and pelting him with heavy leather slippers. In anguished letters sent home from the school, Charles wrote that Gordonston was absolute hell and that the boys around him were foul and relentlessly cruel. It was an experience the traumatized prince would later describe not as a school, but as Colditz in kilts. When Charles's desperate letters describing the relentless bullying arrived at Buckingham Palace, they met an immovable wall of institutional silence. Queen Elizabeth II was fully consumed by red constitutional dispatch boxes, overseas tours, and the unyielding demands of the crown, adhering strictly to the royal convention that sovereign parents must never intervene in the disciplinary matters of boarding schools. Domestic discipline remained entirely in Philip's hands. Prince Philip did not ignore his son's cries for help, but his replies offered no comfort or tenderness. Written with the blunt economy of a naval commander, Philip's letters urged Charles to stop feeling sorry for himself, to rise above the teasing, and to develop the thick skin demanded of a royal sovereign. Where a father thought he was imparting vital lessons in resilience, a bruised, lonely schoolboy felt only cold judgment and parental rejection. Charles found his only emotional refuge during holidays spent with the Queen Mother at Birkhall on the Balmoral estate and at Clarence House in London. There, away from the freezing dormitories and his father's scrutinizing glare, his grandmother nurtured his love for classical music, encouraged his watercolor painting, and gave him the unconditional affection he was starved of at school. The stark contrast between the Queen Mother's warmth and Philip's stern expectations left a lasting impression on Charles. Within the House of Windsor, personal feelings were secondary to the demands of duty. It was an internal wound Charles carried quietly for 30 years, until he decided to strike back in public. For generations, the British monarchy survived on an ironclad maxim: never complain, never explain. That code had shielded the crown for over a century, but in 1994, Prince Charles detonated it from within, exposing the rawest wounds of his childhood to the world. Still reeling from the bitter breakdown of his marriage and the fallout of Andrew Morton's explosive 1992 biography of Princess Diana, Charles resolved to present his own side of the story. Collaborating directly with respected journalist Jonathan Dimbleby, Charles authorized an exhaustive television documentary and a 500-page biography titled The Prince of Wales. In an unprecedented move, Charles opened his private vaults, handing Dimbleby his intimate childhood journals, personal letters, and private diaries. When the book was published, the revelation sent shockwaves through the royal household. Backed directly by Charles's own written testimony, the biography placed the blame for his lifelong emotional insecurity squarely upon his parents. It described Prince Philip as an overbearing, hectoring father whose biting sarcasm and force of personality had regularly reduced young Charles to tears. Queen Elizabeth II was depicted as a remote, emotionally unavailable mother who remained detached from her son's daily suffering. By airing these private wounds, Charles broke the ultimate royal taboo. Prince Philip was furious and deeply wounded, viewing the public release of family letters as a betrayal of everything the crown stood for. The childhood rift forged in the dormitories of Gordonston had now become a permanent public chasm. When the time came in the late 1990s to educate his own sons, Prince Charles drew an immovable line. He refused to send William and Harry north to Gordonston, enrolling William in 1995 and Harry in 1998 at Eton College. the very institution the Queen Mother had fought for 3 decades earlier. It was a complete, deliberate rejection of Prince Philip's Spartan philosophy. At Eton, just a short walk across the Thames footbridge from Windsor Castle, William was able to stroll over regularly for Sunday lunches with Queen Elizabeth II, grounding his royal training in proximity to family support rather than brutal isolation. Charles made an active choice to break the generational pattern, giving his sons the affection, encouragement, and personal freedom he had been denied. Yet breaking the cycle for the next generation could not mend the fracture between father and son. While Charles and Philip found common ground in their final years through shared passions for environmental conservation and traditional crafts, the emotional distance created in the 1960s remained until the end. As Prince Philip once admitted with typical frankness, Charles was a romantic who felt everything deeply, while he was a pragmatist who lived by stoic detachment. When Prince Philip died in April 2021 at the age of 99, that complex silence became permanent. Philip's Spartan experiment had succeeded in producing a disciplined, dutiful monarch for the throne, but the price of that experiment was an irreparable divide between a father and his heir. If you want more stories uncovering the hidden power, private betrayals, and true history behind the crown, subscribe to Palace Scandals.